The sun dipped low over Los Angeles, casting a warm, almost deceptive glow over the city as whispers of a scandal unlike any other began to ripple through the tightly wound world of fashion, power, and legacy. At the center of it all stood Taylor Hayes and Deacon Sharp, two figures whose histories were as complicated as they were controversial, now shockingly united by a secret wedding that no one, not Ridge, not Brooke, not even Steffi, had seen coming. But this wasn't a spontaneous act of love or a reckless decision born of passion. No, beneath the carefully orchestrated smiles and the quiet ceremony lay a plan, one so intricate, so calculated, that its consequences threatened to upend everything the Forrester and Logan families believed they understood about loyalty, betrayal, and redemption. For Taylor, the decision had not come easily. She had spent years trying to reclaim her sense of self, to rise above the heartbreaks that had defined her past, particularly where Ridge was concerned. Yet every attempt to move forward seemed to circle back to the same painful truth. She was always second in his heart. Brooke's shadow loomed large, impossible to escape. And while Taylor had convinced herself that she had made peace with that reality, something inside her had begun to shift in recent months, a growing awareness that perhaps peace was not enough. Perhaps she deserved more than acceptance of loss. Perhaps she deserved control. Deacon, on the other hand, had his own reasons for stepping into this unexpected alliance. Once dismissed as an opportunist and an outsider, he had clawed his way toward a semblance of respectability, building a business, mending fractured relationships, and proving, at least on the surface, that he was no longer the reckless man he used to be. But redemption, he had learned, was a fragile thing. No matter how much he changed, the stigma of his past lingered, shaping how others saw him and limiting how far he could truly rise. When Taylor approached him with her proposition, it wasn't love that sealed the deal, it was mutual understanding. They were both, in their own ways, underestimated, overlooked, and perhaps, together, they could change that. The wedding itself was quiet, almost eerily so. Held at a secluded location with only a handful of witnesses bound by strict confidentiality, it lacked the grandeur typically associated with unions in their world. There were no extravagant gowns, no press releases, no dramatic declarations. Just two people standing side by side, exchanging vows that sounded sincere but carried layers of meaning hidden beneath the surface. To anyone who might have stumbled upon the scene, it would have appeared as a simple act of love. But simplicity was the last thing this was, because the truth, the real plan, was something far more strategic. Taylor and Deacon had not married for romance. They had married for leverage. It began with a series of private conversations, late-night meetings where grievances were laid bare and possibilities were explored. Taylor spoke of the Forrester empire, of how its power dynamics had remained largely unchanged for years, dictated by old loyalties and even older grudges. She knew the inner workings of the family better than almost anyone, and she understood where its vulnerabilities lay. Deacon listened, offering insights of his own, particularly when it came to the Logan side of the equation. His connection to Hope, his complicated history with Brooke, these were not just personal ties. They were potential entry points into a system that had long kept him at arm's length. Together, they began to see a path forward. A way to disrupt the status quo. The marriage would be their foundation. A partnership that, on the surface, could be dismissed or ridiculed by those who underestimated them, but beneath that surface would serve as a united front, a merging of two perspectives, two networks, two sets of influence. With Taylor's credibility and Deacon's unpredictability, they could position themselves as a force that neither the Forresters nor the Logans could easily ignore. But what exactly were they planning? The answer unfolded in layers. The first phase was about perception. By keeping the wedding secret, they controlled the narrative. When the truth eventually came out, and they both knew it would do so on their terms, at a moment carefully chosen to maximize impact. The shock alone would be enough to destabilize those around them, creating a window of opportunity. People would scramble for answers, for explanations, and in that chaos, Taylor and Deacon would begin to assert their presence. The second phase involved alliances. Taylor, despite her struggles, still held a degree of respect within the Forrester circle. Deacon, though often viewed with suspicion, had connections that ran deeper than many realized. By combining their networks, they could reach individuals who felt sidelined or disillusioned, those who might be willing to support a shift in power if it meant advancing their own positions. It wasn't about creating enemies, it was about identifying opportunities. And then there was the third phase, the one that remained largely unspoken even between them, yet lingered in every glance and every carefully chosen word. It was about legacy. Both Taylor and Deacon had children whose futures were intertwined with the very families that had often rejected them. For Taylor, it was about ensuring that Steffi and Thomas had a stronger foothold, a future not dictated by the same cycles of heartbreak and rivalry that had defined her own life. For Deacon, it was about hope, about giving her a world where her father's past did not continue to cast a shadow over her opportunities. If they could reshape the balance of power, even slightly, they could alter the trajectory of those futures. Of course, such ambitions came with risks. Enormous ones. The moment their secret wedding was revealed, the backlash would be immediate and intense. Ridge would feel betrayed, not just by Taylor, but by the implication that she had moved on in such a calculated way. Brooke would see it as yet another provocation, another chapter in a rivalry that refused to fade. Steffi's reaction would be perhaps the most unpredictable of all, torn between her loyalty to her mother and her deep mistrust of Deacon. And Hope would be forced to reconcile her desire to believe in her father's redemption with the possibility that he had once again become entangled in something far more complicated than he let on. Yet Taylor and Deacon were prepared for this. In fact, they were counting on it. Because every emotional reaction, every confrontation, every accusation would serve to draw attention, to shift focus, to create the very instability they needed to advance their plan. They understood that in their world, drama was not just inevitable, it was a currency. And they intended to spend it wisely. As days turned into weeks, subtle changes began to emerge. Conversations grew more tense. Decisions within the Forrester company faced unexpected opposition. Long-standing alliances showed signs of strain. No one could quite pinpoint the cause, but the sense that something was shifting, something significant, became impossible to ignore. And all the while, Taylor and Deacon maintained their composure, playing their roles with careful precision. To some, their eventual public reveal of the marriage came as a shock. To others, it was a scandal. But to those who looked closely, who paid attention to the undercurrents beneath the surface, it was something else entirely. A move. A deliberate, calculated move in a game that had been stagnant for far too long. The real plan behind Taylor and Deacon's secret wedding was never about love alone. It was about power, perception, and the possibility of rewriting a narrative that had been dictated by the same voices for too long. Whether they would succeed remained uncertain. The forces they were challenging were deeply entrenched, and the personal cost of their actions was only just beginning to reveal itself. But one thing was clear, nothing would ever be quite the same again. And as the dust from their explosive revelation began to settle, though in truth, it never fully could in a world like theirs, the deeper consequences of Taylor and Deacon's union started to take shape in ways even they hadn't entirely anticipated. What they had engineered as a controlled disruption quickly evolved into something far more volatile, because the one variable no strategy could ever fully contain was emotion. Ridge's reaction, for instance, went beyond mere betrayal. It struck at his identity, at the foundation of how he saw both Taylor and himself. For years, he had existed in a constant push and pull between two women, subconsciously believing that no matter how far things drifted, Taylor would always remain tethered to him in some unspoken way. Her marriage to Deacon shattered that illusion completely, not just because she had moved on, but because she had done so with a man Ridge had never considered a serious contender. That, more than anything, ignited something dangerous in him, a need to reassert control, to understand how he had lost his place in a narrative he once dominated. Brooke, meanwhile, found herself in a position she hadn't expected, caught between vindication and unease. On one hand, Taylor's decisions seemed to confirm everything Brooke had long believed about her rival's instability, her tendency to make choices that would inevitably lead to chaos. But on the other hand, there was something unsettling about how deliberate this felt. Brooke had spent years navigating emotional battles, but this felt strategic. And if Taylor was no longer acting purely from the heart, then the rules of their long-standing rivalry had changed in ways Brooke couldn't easily predict. That uncertainty began to creep into her decisions, her conversations, even her interactions with Ridge, creating small fractures that hadn't existed before. Steffi's reaction proved to be one of the most pivotal. Initially, it was anger, sharp, immediate, and deeply personal. Deacon represented everything she distrusted, everything she had fought to keep at a distance from her family. The idea that her mother had willingly brought him into their lives in such a permanent way felt like a betrayal not just of her, but of everything Taylor had once stood for. Yet beneath that anger was confusion. Because as much as she wanted to reject the marriage outright, she couldn't ignore the subtle changes in her mother. There was a steadiness to Taylor now, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, Taylor wasn't reacting to the world around her. She was shaping it. And that realization planted a seed of doubt in Steffi's mind. What if there was more to this than she could see? Hope, on the other hand, faced a quieter, but equally profound internal struggle. She had spent so much of her life reconciling the idea of who her father was with who he was trying to become. Deacon's involvement in something so calculated threatened to blur that line once again. She wanted to believe that this marriage was a step forward, that it represented stability and growth. But the secrecy, the timing, the ripple effects it was causing, it all pointed to something far more complicated. And yet, as she observed him more closely, she began to notice something unexpected. Deacon wasn't acting impulsively. He wasn't scrambling to justify himself or smooth things over. He was calm, confident even. It was a version of him she hadn't seen before, and it made her question whether perhaps this was what his evolution had been leading to all along, not just redemption but reinvention. As these personal reactions unfolded, the broader implications of Taylor and Deacon's plan began to materialize within the business world they were so intricately tied to. Forrester Creations, long accustomed to a certain rhythm of leadership and influence, found itself subtly destabilized. Decisions that would have once passed without resistance were now being questioned. Meetings carried an undercurrent of tension, as if everyone sensed that the balance of power was shifting but couldn't quite identify how or why. Taylor, leveraging her insight into the company's internal dynamics, began to position herself more assertively, not overtly, but in ways that gradually expanded her influence. Deacon, meanwhile, utilized his connections on the outside, creating opportunities and alliances that intersected with Forrester interests in unexpected ways. What made their strategy particularly effective was its ambiguity. They never announced their intentions. They never presented themselves as adversaries. Instead, they operated in the gray space between ally and threat, forcing others to constantly reassess where they stood. And in that constant reassessment, cracks began to form. Long-standing loyalties were tested. Assumptions were challenged. People who had once felt secure in their roles started to question whether that security still existed. But with every move forward, the risks grew more pronounced. Because while Taylor and Deacon had accounted for many variables, the emotional fallout continued to evolve in unpredictable ways. Ridge's determination to understand, and ultimately counter, their actions began to take on an obsessive edge. Brooke's unease started to influence her judgment, leading to decisions that carried unintended consequences. Steffi's internal conflict pushed her into actions that blurred the line between protection and retaliation. And Hope, caught between belief and doubt, found herself at a crossroads that would ultimately define her relationship with her father. Through it all, Taylor and Deacon remained united, but even within their partnership, subtle tensions began to surface. Because while their goals aligned, their motivations were not identical. For Taylor, this was about reclaiming agency, about ensuring that her life, and her family's future, were no longer dictated by the same patterns of the past. For Deacon, it was about proving that he could be more than what everyone expected, that he could operate on the same level as those who had long dismissed him. Those motivations complemented each other, but they also created moments of friction, moments where their perspectives diverged just enough to remind them that this alliance, like everything else in their world, was not immune to strain. And yet, despite the mounting challenges, one thing became increasingly clear. Their plan was working. Not perfectly, not without consequences, but effectively enough to alter the landscape around them. The narrative had shifted. The dynamics had changed. And for the first time in a very long time, the future of their world felt uncertain in a way that couldn't be easily controlled by the same familiar forces. The real question now wasn't whether Taylor and Deacon's secret wedding had a purpose. That much had been proven. The question was how far they were willing to go to see that purpose fulfilled. Because in a world built on power, loyalty, and legacy, every move forward came at a cost. And as the lines between strategy and emotion continued to blur, that cost was only going to rise. And as the weeks stretched into months, the ripple effects of Taylor and Deacon's calculated union deepened into something far more consequential than even their boldest projections had accounted for. What had begun as a strategic disruption was now evolving into a slow-burning transformation of the entire social and professional ecosystem surrounding them. The brilliance and the danger of their plan lay in its patience. They were no longer reacting to chaos. They were cultivating it, guiding it, allowing it to grow just enough to weaken the structures that had once felt immovable. At the heart of this transformation was Taylor herself, who began stepping into a version of her identity that few had ever truly seen. No longer defined by emotional vulnerability or romantic entanglement, she became measured, observant, and, perhaps most strikingly, decisive. Those who underestimated her found themselves caught off guard in subtle but impactful ways. Conversations that once would have ended with compromise now concluded with quiet finality. She wasn't raising her voice or making grand declarations. She didn't need to. Her confidence carried an authority that demanded attention, and for the first time, it wasn't derived from her past with Ridge or her role within the Forrester circle. It was entirely her own. Deacon, meanwhile, was undergoing a transformation just as profound, though far less visible to the untrained eye. Where Taylor commanded respect through her composure, Deacon operated through perception, specifically by reshaping it. He leaned into the expectations people had of him, allowing them to believe he was still the unpredictable outsider, the wild card who might derail any situation at a moment's notice. But beneath that carefully maintained image was a level of discipline and foresight that few could have anticipated. He chose his moments carefully, spoke with intention, and most importantly, listened. In rooms where he had once been dismissed, he now gathered information, piecing together insights that would later inform their next moves. Together, they formed a balance that was as effective as it was unexpected. Taylor provided legitimacy and access. Deacon brought adaptability and an outsider's perspective. And as their influence grew, so too did the subtle shifts in the alliances around them. Individuals who had once remained firmly within the orbit of established power began to drift, drawn by the possibility of something new, something less predictable, but potentially more rewarding.